You've probably seen this argument floating around online, this idea that you absolutely cannot be a Christian and a leftist. It's a pretty bold claim, but how does the person making it actually get to that conclusion? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break it down. We're going to trace the logic step by step, from where it starts to its very dramatic finish. So this is the big question, right? Can these two things, Christian values and a leftist political stance, actually line up? The source material we're looking at tackles this head-on, and spoiler alert, it offers a very firm answer. So let's map out exactly how it gets there. All right, here's our roadmap. We're going to follow the argument through these 5 stages. It actually kicks off with some surprising common ground, but then it quickly moves into these big economic and social divides. From there, it strategically pushes other issues off the table to land on what it calls the one final, non-negotiable dividing line.
Okay, so where does this whole thing begin? You might be surprised. It doesn't start with a fight. It actually starts by pointing out a shared value system. The argument's starting point is actually agreement. It basically says, okay, let's look at the goal. And it concedes that values like caring for the oppressed, for widows, for orphans, that these are central to both worldviews. On this one thing, there's no fight. But here's the first twist. Right after finding that common ground, the source immediately claims ownership of those values. The argument is that these aren't leftist ideas at all. They're direct products of Christianity. So yeah, there's common ground, but the source wants to be very clear about who laid the foundation. And this is where we get to the first real break. If both sides agree on the what, caring for the oppressed, the source argues that the entire conflict is about the how. And this is what it calls the economic divide. So the way the argument frames this whole conflict is as a choice between 2 totally opposite methods. You've got a top-down approach on one side and a bottom-up approach on the other. So what do these terms actually mean here? Well, top-down is defined as the government doing it, state-led programs, which the speaker calls the leftist method. On the other hand, bottom-up is presented as the Christian way, change that starts in the heart of the individual and then spreads outward through the church to shape the culture. Okay, so to back up its preference for the bottom-up method, the source then turns to history, and it presents this incredibly stark comparison of what it claims are the real-world results of these 2 competing philosophies. And get this, the scale of the claim here is massive. The argument directly attributes 100 million deaths to these top-down, government-led communist revolutions. This is presented as the ultimate tragic outcome of the leftist approach to making society better. And the contrast couldn't be sharper. The top-down leftist method is said to lead to, and I'm quoting here, destruction, horror, and the worst possible conditions. But the bottom-up Christian method, well, that's credited with nothing less than the conversion of the entire Roman Empire to Christianity. All right, now the argument takes a really sharp turn. It pivots away from the how of economics to what it frames as a way more fundamental, absolutely non-negotiable social issue. This is where the tone really changes, and it gets much, much more absolute. And there it is. This is the core accusation of the social part of the argument, laid out in the speaker's own very strong words. The source claims that the single defining feature of the modern left is an obsession with what it decides to call child sacrifice. So, what is actually meant by this incredibly loaded term? Well, the argument uses it specifically to describe 2 very hot-button political issues: abortion and the practice of providing gender-affirming medical care to kids. The argument then breaks this down using the metaphor of 2 different altars. It describes abortion as a sacrifice on the altar of convenience, and it calls gender-affirming care for minors a sacrifice on the altar of gender ideology. And just to make the point crystal clear, this isn't framed as just a political disagreement. No, it's presented as a full-blown spiritual war. The source sets up this divine versus satanic dichotomy, pitting Jesus, who said, "Let the little children come to me," against the speaker's view of Satan's goal, which is just, let's destroy children. So this next move is absolutely critical to how the argument works. After setting up this huge social divide, it then intentionally narrows the entire field of debate. It just dismisses other major political topics as if they're completely irrelevant. So what gets pushed aside? Well, really big policy debates, right? Things like border security, immigration, universal health care, all of them are explicitly labeled as distractions from the one thing the source says truly matters. And this quote just lays the strategy bare.
The argument is that even talking about these other topics is just a way to hide from the one issue that's supposedly at the heart of everything. All political conversation is funneled right back to this one single point.
And that brings us to the final stage, the ultimate conclusion. This is the definitive, unshakable reason the source gives for why, in its view, a Christian simply cannot be a leftist. So after getting rid of all those other issues, the argument says that the entire complex world of politics can be boiled down to one thing. It's not a spectrum of different ideas. It's just a simple binary choice between two sides. And there you have it, the final no room for discussion statement. The source concludes that the entire political divide is this: one side wants to destroy children and the other side wants to preserve them. And that full stop at the end, well, that's meant to signal there's just nothing else left to say. So we've walked through the entire logic of this argument, from that little bit of common ground all the way to this absolute conclusion. And it leaves us with one final question to think about. What actually happens to our ability to talk to each other when a hugely complex political and theological debate gets framed as a single all-or-nothing moral choice?